It is time for a regime change. The humans have held the reins of this federation for over 3 millennia, and it is time for them to admit they are no longer worthy of their position. It is time for the elders to make way for the new blood. I call for a vote to replace the current speaker. The Argobi representative's voice was full of passion and righteous indignation as he spoke, his throat frills flaring out occasionally as if for emphasis. The human representative who held the position of High Speaker was seated in the center of the massive circular chamber, surrounded by walls with hundreds upon hundreds of alcoves carved into them. Seated within were ambassadors of the various and diverse races who made up the Federation. The speaker's chair was positioned on the ground floor of the chamber, and for convenience when a representative wished to take the floor, a massive hologram would be projected in the air above the speaker for the others to watch and listen to. Likewise, when it was the speaker's turn, they would instead be shown, and when anyone wanted to interject, a ring around their alcove would light up. This function was also used for when votes took place. Votes like this. Several alcoves lit up, signaling that they seconded the Argobi's motion. Unsurprisingly, these were some of the passionate representative's close allies, and to his credit, the speaker appeared neither angry or concerned about the vote, simply looking up through the projected image of the Argobi to look directly at the alien's face, the corners of his mouth raised in light amusement. Well then, it looks like we have a vote on our hands. We will take a 10-minute recess to allow some time for our esteemed colleagues to organize their thoughts and converse with others to decide where their votes will fall. While the others started private group chats between allies from their alcoves, the human simply rested his head against the back of his chair and closed his eyes. The Argobi and his allies saw this and were already celebrating their victory. The human wasn't even trying to secure votes and seemed to have given up on even attempting to do so. The look he'd received from the man nagged in the back of his mind, but his own ego and the affirming words of his conspirators drowned out that minor concern. In reality, the human was trying to think back through the history of the Federation and remember the first instance of humanity's authority being challenged. He had obviously not been born yet, but he recalled in his studies as a teenager that the reason championed at the time was along the lines of humanity being too immature to hold such a position. Oh, how times had changed. First they were too young and now they were too old. To be fair, they were a fairly ancient race by now. Having been a part of the Federation had less than 100 member species over 6,000 years ago. In truth, they had been in some form of control for most of that time, subtly using their ever-increasing sway to change and enact fail-safe laws and codes to prevent any species from holding the main seat of power hostage. Power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely. It was a well-known phrase among humans, and so while they wanted to hold the reins and prove themselves worthy to lead the Federation long into the future, they took the time to make sure they couldn't take advantage of the system, to make sure that if the day came when they needed to be stopped, there were methods the other races could use to do so. And when they were confident in the measures they had taken, the ability for a single representative to call for the speaker's removal being one of them, they finally put forth their bid for power and graciously accepted when it was given. If, for some reason, humanity fell out entirely with the Federation, that would be on the other races to deal with, but at the very least the humans made sure they couldn't abuse the Federation and force the other species to play along with their games. They knew better than any how dangerous they could be and how good they were at manipulating others. Only the humans could truly contain the humans. The speaker opened his eyes after the 10 minutes had elapsed and his hologram filled the air above him. The assembly will return to order. We will now commence the vote. All in favor of removing the High Speaker from their position? The Argobi's alcove lit up first, followed immediately by several dozen others, and that was it. Forget a majority. The number of illuminated alcoves could have been tripled and they still wouldn't have reached the halfway mark. The Argobi stood stunned, his mouth opening and closing repeatedly, his frills pressed flat against his neck, unable to utter a single word. All opposed? A wave of light wound its way up and around the chamber as hundreds of alcoves lit up, many of the occupants looking at the Argobi representative with that same amusement the human had shown previously. 68 in favor and 473 opposed, the motion fails to pass. Is there any new business that anyone would like to introduce before we move on to the day's scheduled matters? No? Then let us continue. The next item on the agenda is the request for financial aid from The human moved on from their attempted ousting without skipping a beat, and led the assembly for the rest of the session while the Argobi representative sat in abject silence. It felt as though he was trapped in his own mind, going over all of the events and meetings that had led to this moment, what was supposed to be his triumphant victory. But the more he did, the more he realized just how much he had deluded himself into thinking he ever had a chance. It only now struck him why the human's amused smile had bothered him as much as it did. Because he'd seen it before, from all the representatives he had approached with his plan. Not the ones who echoed his sentiments and voted with him, but the ones who had listened to what he had to say before smiling with that same smile and excusing themselves to take a call or go to a meeting. At the time, he had taken those smiles as silent affirmations, that even if they wouldn't lead the charge, they would support him from behind while he waved the banner. He had become a victim of an echo chamber he created, using his vocal minority of allies to hype himself up and blind him to the fact that those smiles hadn't been ones of support, but of amusement and sympathy. They'd seen that his passion had overridden his reason, and any attempt to dissuade him from his chosen course would have been in vain. So they held their tongues and waited for him to let his failure snap him out of it. The most bittersweet thing about the entire situation was when it was all said and done, it wasn't his once loud and proud allies who reached out to comfort and console him. No, they had suddenly cut all lines of communication, wanting to distance themselves from someone who had openly tried to pry power from humanity's clearly unshakable grip, as if they themselves were somehow innocent bystanders. It had been the High Speaker himself, sending a message on the Argobi's personal device. "We're good. Really. Don't sweat it." That simple message nearly brought the hymn to tears, but it was only the beginning. More came flooding in from humanity's allies, some just checking in to see how he was doing and others recounting the times their own race had tried something similar and met with the same results. There were even those who joked that it almost seemed to be a rite of passage at this point for a species to challenge the humans. One representative had even made a group chat. Humanity's brutality, adaptability, and determination were legendary across the galaxy, but today was the first time the Argobi had personally experienced their compassion and willingness to forgive. The more he thought about it, the more he became convinced that was the most intimidating aspect of all. How many enemies and rivals had fallen at humanity's feet only for them to reach out their hand in friendship? Some might have seen that as a sign of weakness, to offer peace to a defeated foe instead of finishing them off, knowing full well they could one day turn around and bite the very same hand that spared them. But how many of those races were still around? How many had mistaken humanity's kindness for weakness and ended up begging for their compassion a second time, only to find that humanity's mercy had its limits? This was a mistake the Argobi would never make and a lesson he would never forget.